we stopped at AIM. So I want to go back over some of the aim of the anti-bias education, which is inclusive, positive self-esteem for all. Empathy, again, I think I want to really focus in on that empathy before we get into the activism in the face of injustice. The empathy is some of the precursors to resilience. We talk a lot about being resilient. Empathy and compassion are the precursors. So when you're looking at anti-bias education, you definitely want to look at it through an empathetic lens. So that's a really critical piece there. Also, the anti-bias curriculum allows you to confront your differences. Instead of covering them up, you want to confront them. Also, anti-bias curriculum, you want to look at your own your racial prejudices and your biases. And we'll look at our biases as we walk through this presentation. There's a couple of tools that I can share with you. Some are evaluative and some are developmental, and we'll focus more on the developmental portion of it, because being anti-bias or anti-racist doesn't happen in a single event. It happens throughout a process. So here's one of my favorite quotes from Louise Dorman Sparks. It's not sufficient to be non-biased and also highly unlikely, nor is it sufficient to be an observer. It is necessary for each individual to actively intervene, to challenge and to counter the personal and institutional behaviors that perpetuate oppression. And a lot of times the oppression is occurring within schools where students are being oppressed, whether it be the curriculum, whether it be the systems that prevent them from moving on. If you're an English language learner and you don't have access to specific curriculum to enter college, or if you are, or if you're working with students who have disabilities, sometimes there are some oppressive issues that occur within those particular environments. The idea behind where the challenges are in the classroom are, it really relates to teaching or being trained to support multicultural education. And that still pretty much reigns true today, where sometimes teachers don't have or feel adequately supported to take on some of the challenges that they're faced with. Outside of just the teaching and learning, the social emotional needs, and then the anti-bias work that sometimes takes place within the community and not necessarily in the classroom. So those are some of the challenges that are being faced. To learn about bias, this is kind of a framework, so to speak. You have to look at it through three perspectives, where you're looking at the historical, socioeconomic, and political context of bias, because there's going to be three. You're going to see kind of the intersections of how they relate to anti-bias education. We know here's kind of the pathways to end segregation from the prior to Brown versus Board of Education. Here are some significant Supreme Court cases that occurred. When you look at the Maryland case at the very top here, you see establishing new academic programs for or at Black colleges, still separate, but still having the opportunity to get advanced education. When you look down at the Sipple versus Oklahoma State Board of Education, immediately the ruling was immediately open a Black law school or close a white school until a Black one was open. So you started to see the idea that segregated schools are on the brink of being eliminated, because you have to provide equal access under the laws. They're making a way for the most famous case, which is the Brown versus Board of Education. Here's another one here, McLaurin in Oklahoma versus Oklahoma in 1950. The Supreme Court ordered University of Oklahoma to admit McLaurin to the graduate school. Instead of setting up a makeshift school, Oklahoma maintained segregation by isolating him while on campus. The court intervened and he must receive the same treatment as the other students. So again, the court ruled to allow the individuals to intervene or to be admitted to the school, but still being isolated. So that social isolation still does occur today. So obviously the more famous case that we all hear about is the Brown versus Board of Education, when we had, the Supreme Court rule unanimously to integrate all the schools and to desegregate the schools. We haven't fully gotten to a integrative model, but here's some of the reasons that you might see kind of the sentiment around the Brown decision, where in fact there were Black educators who did not like did not like the desegregation, because they felt like the white teachers would not provide the adequate education that their students need. And also, whenever there's consolidation, it creates job loss. So you see, whenever you consolidate schools, some teachers are going to be out of work. The other piece was a lot of white teachers weren't trained to work with Black children and vice versa. And then you had the communities thinking that the white families would not support a school who had a Black teacher. So there are multiple things. And in this book by Professor Vanessa Walker talks about the lost education of Horace Tate. And what really stuck out to me is seeing a principal get demoted to being a bus attendant, despite going north to get advanced degrees. So in fact, there were a lot of African-American or Black teachers who were highly qualified, but they were out of a job. And that kind of led to what's considered situational poverty. So here, I don't know, Amber, if there's some questions, I think I want to open up for some questions due to that delay. There might be some things in the chat box before we get into the Kurt Lewin behavior is a function of the person and environment. So I'll stop it right here to see if there are some questions in the chat box there.
Sure, we'll just take a brief pause for about 30 seconds or so to see if there's any questions.
Absolutely, I see one with Mendez, Westminster case, yeah, in California.
All right, so we will continue moving through the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the screen share here. So here's Kurt Lewin's idea around behavior is a function of the person and the environment. And the concept is if the environment and the behavior changes, then the person might change. So behavior is culturally taught, how we see, how we look, how we act. Changing these in a real sense changes the perceived culture within which we live. So again, sometimes behavior is learned, but what's really important here is to focus and tensions that move us to action. So when you think about anti-bias work, there has to be some focus and there are some tensions that will move us to act in a certain way, whether it's around the curriculum and how it's being taught and tested, but also how we interact with students. And we have to look at culture more than just music, food, and clothes and outward appearance. We have to see culture through the lens of the students, where you're seeing it from how do they view the world that's around them. So intentions or determining tendencies down here is what matters most, right? I think, Dr. McKenna once said that, good schools are filled with teachers that believe all children can learn. And that kind of sticks with me, where that should be our intention when we look at schools. But again, if we can create those environments and really teach the proper behaviors, then we will see a person that does have the potential to change in a perfect sense of where, this is really theoretical in a sense, but it's not always accurate, because we see different outcomes that occur in the spaces that we work. So Lewin talks about a life space as a function. Lewin affirmed that psychology cannot try to explain everything with a single construct, right? It has to be interrelated in a logically precise manner. So we're looking for psychological forces and intentions that arise from motives, goals, and how people perceive their situation. So sometimes perception is reality for most. And again, we had a perception where the teachers I'm gonna stop it here for a second. The teachers looked at the Brown decision. Instead of collaboration, they looked at competition. So if you could imagine a co-taught model with white and Black teachers in the classrooms together, we probably would have been moving further along. But it looks like the perception was something was being thrown on them, or they were at a loss. And that kind of relates to anti-bias work too, where, if it's not bought in collaboration and we're not working on this together in a developmental way, people will think this is just another thing that they're asked to do. And again, this is a long process in order to really understand the full works of anti-bias. And again, the goal here is to have you dig deeper. This isn't a transactional symposium where you can just check this off. This is something here where you're going to go dig deeper around your own reflection around how to be anti-bias. As you look at equity-oriented resources and the criteria that we'll share a little bit later around what that looks like in your classroom and how to look at materials you're using with your students. How often do you give students the opportunity to demonstrate anti-bias activities? So those are some of the things that we will definitely take a look at a little bit later. I think I do want to stop here again to make sure there aren't any questions just yet, because I know Amber, you had a few that were coming in.
Yes, so one of the questions we received is, how do white teachers currently working in an education in all areas of the curriculum that may have been possibly missed so far?
Can you give me that one more time? So they're working in all areas of the curriculum? Is that your question?
Yeah, so Shelley is asking, how do white teachers currently working get an education in all areas of the curriculum that they may have missed up to this point?
You know, I think when you look at curriculum in all areas, I think we will talk a lot about culturally responsive pedagogy. When you start to get the education, you'll start to look at it through an equity-focused lens, and that's how you begin to educate yourself on the materials. Like whatever is being given to you as a sample, we have to remember that standards aren't curriculum. Standards are what you hope to achieve as students go through the curriculum. So you have the opportunity to be really selective on the materials that you take. I know there's several books out there around, and then we'll share a lot about some of the readings. Definitely, I see Chris Edmonds being mentioned in the chat box. But I really think that it's really a daily approach of being reflective on how you approach your cultural interactions on a day-to-day basis with your students. So yeah, we'll dive more into it. And I think that's a great question. So I'm going to go back to, is there more? I'll stop for a couple more. It looks like there's a couple more.
Yes, Dr. Hill. So the next question is, can you speak a little bit more about anti-racist grading policies, or possibly suggest some resources for furthering their reading and anti-racist grading policies?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know here at Pacific Oaks, we really try to take the bias out of everything that we do. And I think anti-race grading is so subjective depending on the assignment or the task that you're hoping to complete. It really is looking at it through a culturally sensitive lens, knowing your students. So the best approach is to get to know your students before you yield out a grade, because sometimes teachers are put in vulnerable spaces where they're up against the clock, and sometimes the policies and practices don't allow us to do what's best for kids. And I definitely understand that. But really looking at we'll talk more about a rubric that you can use, because I don't want to, because there's really no prescriptive way to do anti-bias grading. I don't think there's a prescription to it, but I think it is, it's situational in terms of what the students are and their ability level and what the expectations are. So then you can base your rubric or scoring off of that. So I really think that might be some of the critical points of looking at an anti-bias framework for grading. So I'm going to go into, I'll take one more question here, because I really like the dialogue. If we were in person, we would really have an interesting time in terms of being able to move around. But this is great. If I can take a couple more questions before I move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so the final question before we move on to the next slide is, can you speak a little bit more about professional development in schools, and what would you recommend for school leaders to look for in bringing in quality professional development?
Professional development, I think that's a great question too. In terms of professional development, I would definitely start with looking at Branch Educator Alliance, Branch Ed. They do a lot of work around equity-focused work, looking at anti-bias curriculum, looking at how your schools and your cultures work within the school climate. They're a great resource there. I would also look at open educational resources. We do a lot of work with the OER area, where you can find resources to improve your professional development. but also you might need a cultural baseline. And we'll talk a lot about what's called the IDI in this session, the Intercultural Development Inventory. And that's something that seems to work well to get a baseline around your perception around perceived orientations around culture and race and bias. So again, these are wonderful questions. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here so I can go on to the next slide. Okay, so we were looking at Lewin's life spaces as a function, looking at perception around how people perceive situations. And then here's kind of what it looks like in theory in terms of the barriers. When you're looking at anti-bias, sometimes it's the materials that are biased or the testing. Later on, I'll show you about 27 years of testing data that shows the achievement gap. So you'll see this with Lewin when you're looking at we'll start up here at the top with the physical environment, where the vectors are the forces restraining you to getting to your goals. The barrier sometimes could be an interaction. It could be poverty, right? It could be racism. There are so many barriers that could be in this particular spot to really create that problem for a person trying to reach their ultimate goals over here. The other piece is the life boundary spaces. If you're in a segregated or an isolated space, you may not have the flexibility or mobility to achieve at certain levels. So again, you will see sometimes the life boundary spaces due to situations also have an impact. So again, this is a really good illustration of what that looks like when you're comparing the person and the environment and what happens in that environment. If it's a multicultural environment, or if it's just specifically a person within a segregated environment. So this is kind of where you see some of the barriers that can occur within the physical environment, but also the person trying to navigate that space to get to their ultimate goals. And again, here's some definitions around the environment. And within the environment, you're looking at, it's subject to cognitive restructuring. It becomes better understood as he or she does a better job distinguishing the real world versus the irreal world. So the wishes and fears. So the person finds new social roles and learns new social norms and codes. So again, this is something where when we look at environments, people have to adapt. So when you look at looking at whiteness or anti-Blackness, you started to see people assimilating to Eurocentric values as a form of survival. So that was kind of what would happen in that environment, so that they learned those new codes just to survive. On the flip side, we do see changes can be carried out in ways that respect and humanize our opponents as well as ourselves. If carried out in violent, dehumanizing, it is self-defeating. So we kind of see that in a sense with schools. So I've been working on a conceptual framework here that I'll share. Some work around second generation segregation, as you've seen a lot so far around the behavior, the person and the environment. So what's happening in schools, and not every school, and again, this isn't just pointing out anybody individually, but when we look at things as a whole, a disgraced education within situational poverty caused by a crisis or an event. Sometimes it could be displacement from a natural disaster, or it could be a result of some racism or some terror. So again, getting a disgraced education is leading into second generation segregation. Some of the folks that are English language learners, research is showing they're experiencing triple segregation. They're isolated from economic opportunities, educational opportunities, and well, they're being socially isolated as well. So you'll see this in that framework. And I do wanna stop it here just to take some questions, because I think there might be some questions around looking at this conceptual framework around second generation segregation. because we've looked at the Brown decision that's been over 66 years and we still haven't fully integrated. So you can still see there are so many schools that are still segregated. So I don't know if there's any questions, or I'm going to stop it right here just to see if there's questions popping up, because again, that piece is really critical when students are receiving that disgraced education, whether it be the environment, whether it be the materials, the resources, adequate facilities that are happening, that they have access to within their own communities. Again, with the situational poverty that families are being faced with, you start to see that second generation segregation that leads into school to prison pipeline and some of the other things that we're starting to see. Unfair discipline procedures. It really is, it's really difficult to look at race without looking at poverty, because you see the intersection. There's so much crossover. The intersectionality between race and poverty really does exist. So I don't know, Amber, if there's any questions there within the chat.
Sure. We have a participant who's working around building more curriculum that affirms and centers BIPOC students, and while also wanting to teach white students to be accomplices and the historical roles of whiteness without re-traumatizing BIPOC students. So she wanted to know if you have any recommendations there.
I definitely would look at Dr. Yolanda Silly Ruiz, and she does some work with critical humility. These are women of European descent that use their whiteness to disrupt injustices. So that is definitely an excellent resource to help work through some of the work as allies, right? When you don't really have to ask people if they're racist, you can tell by their behavior a lot of times. So, again, I think I would use that critical humility work that would help really have that discussion with students as they are navigating that space. Because again, it's not about, I think Dr. Grant said it very well, it's not about being against white people, it's speaking out against the privilege that has persisted over 400 plus years with some of the atrocities that we all are well aware of that still continue. So I think that would be an excellent resource for you to work with students. And again, if you're in education is predominantly white middle-class women, still around 80%. So again, it's not about being of color to work with students and support students of color. So that's the other piece, that you don't have to be that race to help those students. If you have that belief that all students can learn and you're willing to see it from their lens with a perspective around empathy and compassion, then I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. So I hope that really gets, that's another great question.
So maybe one additional question that we can take is if there are any recommendations you have for elementary school teachers who are teaching history in America, and if there is a way or any recommendations you have around teaching about some of those cultural disparities in such a way that it doesn't make other ethnicities and nationalities feel inferior.
I think that's an excellent question. That's a 7-hour seminar by itself, but I really think that the recommendations to teach history, again, it really is uncomfortable. And I think we have to, for lack of a better word, lean into the discomfort, but to reassure them that they didn't actually commit it. It's just that you have to acknowledge it and know in your own spaces that that's not acceptable. Because I think me having, I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old too. So I definitely, the questions come up about, if it's George Floyd or why were people mistreated? There's a way that we have to acknowledge it, but we're not blaming the people that live today because they didn't actually do it. But we have to acknowledge some of the benefits from that. Like, people have benefited from that behavior. But I think that that's probably the best way to teach it, and seek out additional materials, because I know when people do their textbook adoptions and some of the things that are in there, some of the historical figures take up more textbook space than I think they should. And we need to really focus in deeper on, if it's a civil rights movement, it's more than just Rosa Parks not sitting, not getting up out of her seat. And I think we have to emphasize that the bus boycott lasted 382 days. So it's a long haul when you're looking to make change, because people don't relinquish power pretty easily. So I think those are some of the things that we can bring in. And now there's so much out there with access with technology that teachers can kind of sift through a lot of materials that really fit your teaching style, but also that have an accurate account, because I think that's really where we need to go in terms of our scholarship for our K-12 folks, because we want to bridge the gap between research and practice. So I really think that's something where, you know, higher education, me being in K-12 for about 17 years before coming over, being able to bridge the gap between practice and research and kind of going into schools and providing some of that additional support is something that we like to do here at Pacific Oaks. So again, I appreciate that question. I think that's really, it's necessary to really look at what we're teaching and how that we want to make sure all kids are included. But again, we don't want to shame them or to make them feel, you know, less fortunate.
Really great free feedback, Dr. Hill. And we know you have so much more great information to share with us. So we're going to continue in with the presentation and continue taking questions along the way.
I'm going to go back to the screen share here. So again, I really do want to emphasize that sometimes looking at the disgraced education is sometimes it's a systems failure when we see, you know, things that are working where, you know, adequate funding has been a problem for, gosh, ever since I can remember, in terms of not properly funding schools and providing them with the resources and tools to create better outcomes for students. So again, this is kind of a framework that's been derived from the 1930s, but again, there's work with Mickelson and the Mecklenburg schools that talk about second generation segregation. And people are familiar with Dr. Michelle Alexander, who wrote the New Jim Crow, that kind of ties into that too, seeing the prison system as a way of being a part of the second generation of segregation. The other thing that I can share too is, we know Brown was 1954, so a generation is 40 years. So 1994 to now, we're seeing that second generation really emerge, and the outcomes aren't really significantly different. So we still haven't really reached full integration. But it really is unfair to think that one case could really see out 66 plus years to think about some of the unintended consequences or impact variables that have occurred through time. So that's really an interesting perspective with that. So addressing bias, again, it really is your self-awareness of culture and discriminatory practice, as well as to examine the effects of beliefs, attitudes, and expectations. So again, it's really reflective when you look at your own practice around the anti-bias work. Cultural diversity, if they've learned through experience, they appreciate it as reality, not as an academic exercise. So again, I think learning through experience, we use a lot of the constructivist approach at Pacific Oaks with our teacher ed candidates. So I think they really understand and appreciate the realistic approach to addressing bias. And again, sometimes that reality is formed through those interactions with faculty and students, creating an internalized dialogue. So again, you have to spend a lot of time in reflection to see how you can improve, you know, the learning outcomes for your students, and also how you become more aware of your own biases. So teaching anti-bias curriculum, the knowledge of practice, here's another resource, Cochran, Smith and Lytle, 1999, talks about the knowledge of practice, which is an excellent read for you in terms of learning more about anti-bias curriculum. And again, we did touch on this a little bit, the bridge the research and practice gap to sustain teacher reform efforts. Because again, I know that the practitioners who are, you know, that were, you know, in the classrooms were really, I apologize there. The research and practice to sustain teacher reform efforts. I know that teachers have worked really hard at trying to sustain their reform efforts, but again, sometimes the policies don't really align to the reform. But also here, this is Dr. Tyrone Howard, another excellent resource around multicultural anti-bias work. at UCLA, the potential to raise teacher levels of multicultural consciousness and encourage willingness to help their children question and confront bias issues. So again, I'm going to stop right here just for a second. But again, that really does drive that point home where you want to have children be able to confront those biases, and you have to set up opportunities for them to demonstrate that practice. So I think that's a really, really profound in terms of really addressing or teaching the curriculum, because that's a part of it. It's like when you're giving out bad news as a teacher, it's the same thing as if a student didn't make the mark on that benchmark assessment, or they didn't do as well when you had to report back out to their parents. So it's the same thing when we look at bias. It's like, hey, I want you to be able to confront your bias, but at the same time, I want to raise your multicultural consciousness around those critical discussions. So is there any questions? I know I was going a little quick with that particular slide. It looks like there's some things in the chat. So I want to make sure I get to some of the questions before we move on into the next phase.
So yes, Dr. Hill, one of the questions we received earlier was, what do you think would help attract more minority leaders to the field and fix some of the leaks in the teacher pipeline?
Oh my gosh, that's a wonderful question. And I find myself staying up late at night trying to figure that one out. I think what we could do is we have to remove some of the entry-level barriers to teacher preparation, whether it be exams. Again, there are some biases within some of the exams that teachers have to take. They need to take 7 exams to qualify for their credential here in California. So that is a lot of testing and coursework to enter the profession. I think the other part is we have to change the teaching and work conditions. That's the number one reason that people leave the profession. It's the work conditions. Also, I think there's some challenges around evaluation too, in terms of what is effective. Obviously, the pay. I think I have colleagues at the University of Helsinki in Finland, and the doctors are paid like the lawyers, or the teachers are paid like doctors and lawyers, and everyone loves their educational system there. There's some trust at the government. They don't use the word accountability, they use the word trust. So there's simple things within the language to encourage individuals of color to go into the teacher pipeline. Also having, I think, more opportunities to learn about teaching, because sometimes you're called into the profession. I think teachers don't like to pat themselves on the back for the most part. They don't, educators don't celebrate what they do well, very rarely. So it's just being able to really market ourselves. I think we see students more. So I don't see a lot of high school programs that have a teacher pathway. We have the engineering or STEAM and STEM, but we don't have the educational pathway. Also to really encourage or invite individuals into the teaching profession. But again, I think the teacher shortage with men in general, and African-American males or Latinx males or females are really, it's kind of detrimental. We're at kind of a state of emergency. The teacher shortage is real. And I think it really does, it ties to pay. I think we were on our international Congress, we did an international summit, and our colleagues down in Peru, they have 60,000 students and only 200 are in their teacher ed program. So when we look at entering the profession, it's a global challenge. It's not just here in California, it's all over the world. And it's the same issues, it's work conditions and pay. And the other thing that our colleague Manuel mentioned was the teachers didn't feel respected. So there's a lack of respect around the profession that's really discouraging individuals from entering entering the profession. Can I take a couple more questions before I go into the next slide?
Yes, so our next question is around integrating and implementing anti-racism curriculum into the classroom, and acknowledging that some of those areas may be a little bit more challenging than others, such as math. So how are some ways, or what can educators do to address this and to make such disciplines more accessible to all students?
You know, I think sometimes when you look at integrating anti-racist curriculum, you can highlight the authors that produce the materials that you're using. And that's a form of showing that anti-racist value in terms of who's producing this work. And you can highlight the authors within the curriculum that you're using the material when you're integrating it. I think we need to look at anti-bias across the curriculum, because it should just be throughout the entire lens. It's the same thing when you do your, when we talk about social emotional learning, where that can occur across the curriculum, where it's not really subject specific, it's just embedded in what you do. I know that we do that here with advocacy and social justice, as well as our teacher credentialing, where it's just embedded within the curriculum. Every time we have the opportunity to talk about anti-bias or bring in some other culturally relevant things, that's when we take advantage of it. It's the same thing when you look at Black history. It's not just in February. There's been contributions in every day of the year from someone of color that you could definitely bring up when you do, you know, quotes of the day. There's so many different ways that you could incorporate this into what you do, because I don't think it needs to be an add-on. I think it needs to be a part of the fabric. So really finding ways to involve that in your day-to-day practice would probably be the best solution.
We have another participant who works in a predominantly white independent school in Southern California, and she spoke about some of the resistance around making changes that support BIPOC students in their education. And so she's asking for some ways that they can additionally help reach white teachers, admins, and parents in building the bridge and doing some of this work together to bring about changes in the school system.
You know, I think partnering with parents is really critical to the movement in terms of getting, you know, anti-racist anti-racist work done within your school. The idea is it's difficult. Most people don't want to address it because of the level of comfort, right? Because you're going to have to confront your own biases, and most people aren't in the space to do that. But I think we have to create, you know, it was a term when I was a teacher, a welcoming environment. You know, we invite that resistance in a sense, because we want to help people work through their challenges. And again, here with this slide, I think it kind of really leads in to the slide when we look at racial literacy. And this is Dr. Yolanda Silly Ruiz. And this is her comment around looking at finding ways that racial literacy is a skill, right? And then a way to practice it, right? It's a desired outcome of racial literacy is an outwardly racist society like America for its members of the predominant racial category to adopt anti-racist stance, or a person of color to resist a victim stance. So ideally what we have to do is, there's almost like looking at changing experiences. I have to look at it from the other person's lens would be the best approach to understand some of the racist or anti-racist work. Another good suggestion here that I'd like to make is I would look at Alan Pollack's book. I know it's an interesting read, Why Meadow Died. It's from the Parkland shooting, and that's something too where a dad took an interesting perspective to try to figure out what caused the whole atrocity down there in Parkland. So that's another way to look at not only some of the anti-racist lens, but looking at it from a different perspective. So again, that was really, I'm gonna stop the screen share there for a second. Any other questions before I move on?
I think the final question that we can take is that there seems to be a lot of positions of power that affect top change in schools, and the majority of those require an MA or a PhD. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, what do you recommend for teachers seeking a PhD in diversity and culture on, or rather, anti-bias work?
Well, there are several programs out there in terms of going to get your doctorate or advanced degree. I know here at our school, we go up to a master's level, and then our Saybrook is our partner school who has their, you know, the EDD and management leadership, educational leadership. The other thing I would definitely look at is looking at schools that are going to focus more on that social justice around maybe Loyola Marymount. It just depends on your needs. UCLA, obviously, USC, there's several programs around the Southern California area, depending on where you're located. But that's something that you can dig deeper in, because I know the CSUs and the UCs here in California have mandated a social justice course will be a part of their general eds now, so that people are going to start to get a little bit more in depth with this work around anti-bias work, which is really important for students entering college. But again, I definitely would encourage you to continue to pursue your advanced degrees so that you can be an ally in this work and continue to serve your community well. So I hope that answers that question.
Fantastic, Dr. Hill. We'll continue.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So here's some work here that we were talking about with the equity-oriented resources. This is a criteria from my colleagues at Branch Ed, the Educator Alliance. And here's some of the criteria that you could use to make sure your resources that you're sharing with your students or in your class can measure up to this criteria. So again, the objects include learner-centered activities or assessments, authentic assessment, project-based learning, and some of these things are really consistent with practice. So I was really happy to see it align with what's actually happening in classrooms. Intentional opportunities for collaboration or utilizing learners' experience as content. So I think that's really something interesting in terms of looking at their experiences. So that's how you really can talk about some of the anti-bias work, when you can utilize the students' experiences as a part of the content. Because instead of always looking for resources, we can have the students kind of make sense of their world as reality, as you saw around environment and behavior. So if we can change the environment and support the behavior and help the behavior change, then that person might change. And having their experience come into the classroom in terms of content is really powerful. Here goes the second part of the criteria. In order to be inclusive of diverse learners, race, ethnicity, language, socioeconomic status, etc., object examples and contents draw from a variety of cultures, contexts, and groups. So what we're looking at is finding out, like I mentioned earlier, seeing if you can find different material from publishers and researchers of color, or researchers of diverse backgrounds to incorporate into your classrooms. So that's a really important part of having your equity-oriented resource criteria. These are things that you could use before you select materials to discuss a specific topic. The other thing is just strengthens the learner's sense of purpose and efficacy, right? Because it's so important that students remember their why, and that really does lead into their motivation and also improves learning outcomes. So the other and the last piece of the criteria is the object makes an effort to help learners enact a critical orientation around the curriculum, right? I think we spend a lot of time making sure that students can see themselves reflected into the curriculum, right? So we want to look at more asset-based versus deficit-based narrative. So again, when I look at that asset-based versus the narrative-based, we want to look at the strength-based approach, because we know that schools sometimes have functioned in a deficit model thinking, which led to that disgraced education because students didn't really see it as a strength-based approach. So really focusing on their assets is really a critical part, and having their experiences be a part of the curriculum will really enhance outcomes in terms of learner participation and student motivation. So I'm going to go on to the next. I'm going to go into the next slide here. And this is how you rate it. And again, this is from Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, an excellent resource for those looking for colleagues and different ideas around professional development. Aligned if all 4 criteria are met, partially aligned if 1 to 3 are met, not aligned if none of the criteria are met. So it's a really easy to use kind of rubric for assessing equity-oriented resource criteria. So again, I think that's some of the deep work that's occurring around the country in terms of trying to improve the anti-bias curriculum and the anti-bias education is looking at these kind of tools that will support educators with the day-to-day work that they do with the students. So again, here's another important piece here is exchange of experience. So when we look at this, we're looking at how freedom can only occur when the oppressed rejects the images and fears that have adopted from their oppressors and replace them with autonomy and responsibility. So again, looking at ways to exchange the experience, patience and humility to address inequalities and intolerance. So humility, my definition of humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. So it's being able to put someone ahead of your own needs, and teachers are, they do that every day when they're serving students. So again, there's a little, I'm gonna move on just a little bit. Reflection is a piece that we really wanted to emphasize. I really want to emphasize with you today, looking at your own teaching practice and having that moment to reflect. And the next slide, this is just a snapshot of the symbolic racism scale. Here are two things for us to take just a minute to reflect on. I'm gonna stop just for about 3 minutes and let you look at these two questions. There's about 8 on this scale, but for the purposes of our time together, I only put these 2 on there so that you can take a look at your own feelings around this. So go ahead and take a minute, take 3 minutes, and we'll look at these 2 and we'll open it up for questions. And again, I invite you to put your responses in the chat box if you'd like. It's up to you. It's not mandatory, but if you like to, we invite you to put your responses in the chat box. I'm going to stop the screen share there for a second. Okay, great.
And Dr. Hill, we just had a brief question for someone who possibly might not be able to access the chat box.
Okay.
And would like to know if you'd be able to read those 2 questions.
Oh, I will, for sure. Okay, here, the first question is, it's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could just be as well off as other whites. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. And I'll read it again. It's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as other whites. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. And the second question is, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. I'll read it one more time. Irish, Italian, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, and strongly disagree. And that's from the symbolic racism scale from 2000. So again, I just invite more conversation around just a couple of those questions. Any other questions around those 2 comments? Is that a stereotype? What do you think about some of the symbolic racism that's there? So it's like, I'd like to hear if there's some other comments about that. All experiences are different. Yeah, that's good. it's very interesting that that's on a symbolic racism scale. But again, some people do believe that. So again, it's just something that, you have to assess when you're looking at your interactions around race. And again, this is just a little snapshot just for purposes of what we're doing today. But these are some of the challenges and some of the questions that you'll have to confront. And these are difficult dialogues, because if you ask people that, it could be, depending on if it's not presumed positive intent, you might see it being somewhat offensive to ask people these kind of questions. But again, that's how you get down to really having that critical race discussion, are these kind of questions. Okay, go ahead.
We have a comment from one person who said that prior to having the knowledge that they have now, they probably would have responded a lot differently than they did today. And as a result of the education that they have now, their responses to both are D.
I see. And I think that's really the critical reflection that we look for with our students, our teachers, administrators, families, and the communities that we serve. That's kind of where the growth is. And it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over time. So I think that's really, I think that's really change. That's meaningful change when you can actually see yourself having a different response. And then I just invite people to revisit those kind of activities along the way, just to see where you are. Like I said, this isn't anything that's evaluative. This is all developmental, right? Because then later on, we'll get into a little bit around your perceived orientations around culture. And I think that's really powerful work when you see your orientations in your perceived area and your developmental area. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go on to the next slide. And again, thank you all for your comments and participation. So here are some positives around diversity exposure is associated with lower levels of bias. And obviously, if the school's environment are set up that are conducive to students, it may reduce bias as well. So those are good things about having exposure to diversity. And what I like to do here is, it's important that sometimes we have Black teachers go in affluent areas too, so that it helps white students have better interactions with people of color. Like I said, I've been in affluent school districts too. I spent some time in Beverly Hills Unified too, as a director. So I definitely saw high SES and low SES in my K-12 experience being around in other districts. But that was important for me to be in that role, just so that students there could have that diversity exposure too. Because what happens is we'll see teachers of color, they might be relegated only to the areas that serve minority students. And sometimes I think in education, we actually have to have those teachers go into more affluent areas and vice versa, where you have white teachers come to support kids of color in other environments as well. So again, that exposure, everyone benefits. Here, defining implicit bias. This is the Kirwan Institute, and we talk about this. They suggest implicit bias refers to attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So I want to stop there. So again, it's our attitudes and perceptions, and we talk a little bit about our understandings. I'm glad that comment did come in terms of, my answer would have been different. And I think that's really important in terms of growth, a growth mindset. If the more I'm educated, the better off I am. And Horace Mann said that, public education is the greatest discovery made by man. So the more that we educate people around critical issues, the better off we are as a society. And I think that's, in light of what's happening, I think we're at the tipping point of a transformation, because we have a lot of people being interested in understanding other cultures and learning more about, racism as we've seen, recent events. So again, this is an important piece in terms of defining implicit bias. And again, Dr. Grant kind of set a lot of the foundation for us today with the work around understanding the bias. But in terms of schools, again, we have to watch it through the curriculum, our interactions, our grading practices, our disciplinary procedures, you see a lot of the biases occur where it could be a minor infraction for one kid if you're not culturally aware. If a kid of color raises his voice just because that's how they communicate and that referral is seen as dangerous, there's a different consequence because we had a bias around our actions, our understanding of that tone, right? So these biases encompass a favorable or unfavorable assessment. And a lot of times in defining implicit bias, you might have an unfavorable assessment around what's happening or what's occurring. Rather, implicit bias are not accessible through introspection. So again, your implicit bias is really, really more reflective in a sense in terms of what of how to approach it. So here's some descriptions here. Implicit biases are pervasive. Again, they're related but distinct mental constructs, right? They do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs. I think that's really important. I'm going to stop there just for a second. That's what I mean by developmental level and our perceived orientation. Everyone perceives that, you know, they're not racist or they don't have many biases, and they, like we said, we don't see color. Sometimes that's a challenge in schools because if you don't see color, you make people invisible. So you see color is just how you see it, right? And it should be seen through a different approach. So again, looking at our beliefs may not always align with our actions. So we might have ascribed beliefs, but our behaviors and attitudes are different. So again, that's an important concept around implicit bias. So here's another great resource from Harvard. It's called Project Implicit, and it does really assess. It's an implicit associations test, an IAT. It looks at your associations between the concepts of Black people, the LGBTQIA+, and evaluations of good and bad and stereotypes. What you see down here at the bottom are the faces. A part of that, I've done the assessment a couple of times, and what you see is they give you facial expressions and you have to rate them good or bad. So if you can just see these facial expressions, depending on your, I guess, your mood or vulnerability, you might assume that some of these faces are bad or they're good depending on your perception around culture. So again, I invite you to dig deeper around Project Implicit. It's free. You can definitely sign up with your consent to get the results from the implicit associations test. And it really does look at some of the stereotypes. And again, it's another great resource when you're looking at anti-bias work, just to give yourself some kind of baseline data around how you, how you respond to different biases based on their testing protocol here. Another one, when we talk about the National Equity Project, is another excellent resource around looking at implicit bias and structural racism. They do occur. Again, we started off here looking at history, policies, practices, right? Priming our associations and assumptions, inequitable outcomes and racial disparities. So the National Equity Project really does talk about that. And when we look at inequitable outcomes and racial disparities, a lot of those outcomes do occur within schools. And that's where I'll go back to the second generation segregation slide when I looked at behavior of the person in the environment, a disgraced education. Some people are in extreme poverty or situational poverty, leading into the second generation segregation. So again, the National Equity Project does talk about those disparities. And what happens is a lot of the disparities that Brown and Black children are facing do occur within the schools. And I think that's where the anti-bias work is so critical now. This is really important work. Amber, I want to stop right here and make sure I'm not missing any of the questions that are coming in. And then I will put that back up because I did, I want to put back up the National Equity Project so that everyone can see that, and that may spark a few more questions, because I think that's a really impactful slide in terms of what's happening with structural racism and implicit bias.
We had a comment rather earlier from someone who shared during the questionnaire that you provided.
Okay.
was that these were their exact words: "I was privileged to not understand." And that was really, really powerful and worth mentioning. Um, a most recent question that has come up is, how do I help students understand that it is okay to show that you can learn like everyone else, or that it's okay to try hard even if you make mistakes or fail at times? The point that they're really trying to get to or learn more about is just how can they learn how to change and to be able to make others feel comfortable and safe.
And again, that's just a wonderful reflective practice that I just encourage. The first thing that I share even with our graduate students is give yourself permission not to know everything. And when you do that, you really set the tone and you invite opportunities to learn. The best position for a teacher, leader, an administrator, a district level, a district office person is to be in a position of learning. We're all learning this in this climate and in this space, right? And I think it's okay for us to give ourselves that permission. And I think what that does is it opens you up to receiving more growth. And I think that's the maturity piece, where it just comes with a better understanding of some of these things. And I agree, it is a privilege to learn about racism, right? Because if you've never experienced it, yeah, I mean, it's important, but it's also recognizing that learning is okay. We should be in positions of learning. And for our students too, I think it's okay. Sometimes this is really heavy and deep work, as we refer to it, because it's uncomfortable. And a lot of times it may touch on personal things that have happened. When you look at some of the trauma or atrocities that students are facing and the disparities, you just have to take it in small chunks. Like I said, it's not an activity that we can check box like a transactional part. Understanding anti-bias work is transformational, right? When you look at Pacific Oaks at 75 years, this work, I mean, not only can we talk about, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I mean, we can go back to the Emmett Tills and those folks, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and Dr. Grant mentioned that earlier. So it's okay, and taking it as a process. This is definitely a process that happens over time. And our president, Dr. Bedunton, talks about change, and he's like, if I can move the needle just an inch, I feel like I've done something. And that's the approach we have to take around learning about implicit bias or anti-bias work, and assessing our own assumptions around things, just making sure that our humor can be offensive, and some of the things that we didn't really pay much attention to, because it hurts. Sometimes it hurts people and we don't know that they're being hurt. So just being mindful of that. And I know we touched on that in the opening too, the mindfulness, right? Being mindful of people in these spaces are another good approach in terms of working through understanding and learning more about anti-bias work or anti-racist work. And you said there was a second piece there too, another comment.
Oh yes, so a separate question is, can you speak about questioning teaching practices that may not support all students, such as having students sit quietly during reading when it might be better to allow students to speak, stand, get excited about what they're hearing or reading, and to express that it is okay and not bad behavior?
Absolutely. I think that's something where, again, some of the classroom structures are designed from the industrial era. I know people are familiar with Sir Ken Robinson, and he talks about the paradigm shift. I think the academic noise for students, if they're excited about learning, teachers should be excited about teaching. And I think the way to encourage that is to give students spaces to have that expression. Like I said, bring their own experiences into the content. But at the same time, as you're looking at your scope and sequence and getting through the curriculum that is designed for that particular grade level, you do have to find creative ways to where that's not as disruptive. When we had our study abroad group out here from Peru, they came in, and one of the questions I asked them was, and again, this was all pre-COVID when we could actually get to schools, how do you know students are learning? And when you walk in the classroom, I know that's one of the first things that I'm looking for. I need to know students are learning. And I think the academic noise is okay, but a lot of that is just your cultural cultural humility, is understanding that certain kids like to express themselves that way, and I'm okay with that as a teacher. But again, it's just making sure the norms and values are established. We like to use connection before correction. Once you're connected to the students, as teachers know, you can offer that correction when it's disruptive to someone else. But again, just having that space where, students are okay to, celebrate the success or get excited about what they're studying, I think is wonderful. So I hope that's got that question. There was one more, Amber?
Yes, we have one more from a participant who works
Okay.
in a predominantly white Catholic school.
Okay.
Just started implementing anti-bias work. So they're wondering how can they effectively involve families in their anti-bias efforts, especially since they may receive a lot of pushback from parents and even teachers and students.
I again, another wonderful question. I think there's something too with religion and morality that comes into play. I think the biggest thing is to try to find, again, it's developmental in our perception. It's like, I want to meet the parents where they are, not where I expect them to be. I mean, in a sense, sometimes when you talk social justice in a Catholic school, I mean, a lot of the foundations of school were started by Jesuits. So if you want the best social justice stories, I mean, there's so many things that are from a religious perspective in the Christian faith that you could definitely tap into, that parents are probably well aware of, but maybe have not really explored it in that sense. So again, just finding out ways to incorporate that into their own comfort zone. And it's a little tricky in terms of the Catholic school because it's change. And I understand that some people are really uncomfortable with it, but it is a difficult dialogue. And in order for their children to be competitive and to matriculate through the system and get to college, they're going to have that socially just lens. As we see the shift around schools and higher education, that's definitely something that they will be looking for. It's not just college preparatory, it's making sure that you have a better cultural understanding, because we look at cultural competence, but at Pacific Oaks, we really focus on culturally intelligent. So it's like, I want to understand your culture, because competent could be really difficult in terms of looking at culture, because people may appear the same outwardly, but inwardly they have different views. Like, I know in my own family, I have family that lives in the southern part of the United States. Outwardly, we may look the same, but culturally, we have some different values and belief systems. So again, we have to be really careful around assessing culture and our assumptions too, just on an outward level. Again, these are great questions. Is there any more? I can take one more, and then I'm going to go on to the next slide.
There was a question from earlier from a participant who works with a nonprofit after school program. And they sometimes struggle with teaching intersectional and inclusive activities because it could criticize and maybe challenge the teachings that they're learned in the day earlier at their school. And this at times makes them a little bit resistant, and then mean the students resistant to understanding intersectionality. So just touching on your previous point, if you had any suggestions on how this participant could navigate this.
I think one thing is I see after school as enrichment and a support. If I go back a few slides, I see you as being a tailwind, the vector that's pushing that student towards their ultimate goal. And with enrichment, it's not really reteaching the curriculum that was taught during the day, but the idea behind any level of, disrupting structural racism or anti-bias work is your ability to question. Effective questioning opens the doors to possibilities. And if we destroy children, we destroy infinite possibilities. The fact that you're able to bring these things up in an after-school program and you're doing work beyond the bell, that's really where a lot of the work happens, right? We know when we look at some of the problems with youth, it's between 3 p.m. and 6 is that area where the school's out and there's the after-school piece where there's a lot of mischief that can occur. But again, I see you as being a part of the tailwind, moving that child forward, but also collaborating with the teacher, because you want to take collaboration over competition. But at the same time, you're letting the child explore too. Here, I want you to be able to fact check. I'm going to leave it out there for you to explore on your own. That's the same thing with this session. This session, I don't expect anyone to master anti-bias curriculum. The goal for me is to have you go dig deeper on where I'm showing you some of the ins and outs of how the frameworks are being delivered and displayed. But the goal is for you to take this and dig deeper around specific topics. And how you really make change is one child at a time, one teacher at a time, one principal at a time, one superintendent at a time, one parent at a time. So again, this is something that is for the long haul. This is more part of the journey and not really being focused on the destination. So again, I just encourage you to continue to provide those things to have the child hear different perspectives. Remember, when I first opened up about respect, with one of our core values is getting along with people that you may not agree with. I might have a different perspective on this than some people, and I'm okay with that. I can still get along and have respect for their perspective. I may not agree with it. And I hope that answered that question. Thank you, Amber. That was a wonderful question.
And your answers and feedback are just really incredible and insightful. So we're really looking forward to just continuing the momentum that you've built.
We're gonna keep plugging along here. I'm getting excited about our awareness of bias. So Boyson, they did a study and they reviewed about 139 incidences around explicit bias. And the number one area was stereotypes. And again, Dr. Grant talked a lot about that today. And 47%, almost half of the incidences were stereotypes. So again, when you look at stereotypes, again, it's your perception and your beliefs and actions around a specific group. And this is explicit bias. So this is more, outwardly. And then offensive jokes and humor, avoidance and isolation, right? So that could be like segregation. We talked about triple segregation with a lot of the Latinx folks who are considered newcomers to the country, or long-term LTELs that are in the EL programs, insults, and then other. The other study was a follow-up study. They had about 159 targets, and sexual orientation was a result of bias being number one. Race was 2, class and disability. But sometimes I think this disability number, because sometimes a disability number could be intersected with class, race, and sexual orientation. So again, some people, again, they may not want to really mention their disability, but also you might see that too with bias, right? I know earlier people were talking about ableism a lot in terms of having a bias with someone who has a disability over somebody who is more able-bodied. I spent a lot of time in special education, and I know that students who have learning disabilities are, in my view, general education students who need support. So again, there's a difference between a handout and a hand up, and we have to really keep that in mind when we're looking at our own reflection around our biases with people's academic skills or cognitive levels. So again, we're looking at, some of the data is really consistent with what's happening in terms of stereotypes are, again, some of the leading causes for our explicit bias. Here's some of the effective strategies, and Linda Darling-Hammond talked a lot about hiring and the retention of high quality teachers. I know that's one of our main visions in the Department of Education, is to make sure that we train and prepare high quality teachers. So when they get into communities and school districts and support families, they're ready to go. The part I really want to emphasize from Linda Darling-Hammond is the strategic curriculum design. And we keep mentioning that with finding ways to incorporate the students in the curriculum, finding ways to really bring in the anti-bias work around the strategic design. And I think that's a larger discussion with instructional teams who really want to do the heavy lift around having an intentional design around anti-bias work. Instructional improvement in each classroom and across each classroom. Being in that continuous improvement model is definitely an effective strategy. A lot of the anti-bias work, sometimes it's great. It has to be in the classroom, but the entire district culture has to want to support it. It's the same thing when you have a social emotional learning or character counts, or you're looking at implementing a new system. It really is buy-in when your Board of Education, your district leadership, and each site principal and each teacher and instructional aide, the whole support system starts to buy in. And that's when you'll really start to see how the anti-bias work will happen. As people are becoming more ACEs aware and trauma informed around their practice, we have to do the same thing with anti-bias work. Teacher ownership of professional learning communities and school improvement. Again, the teachers have to be a bigger part of that conversation around that strategic curriculum design, because you guys are delivering it. I do want to stop here because these are strategies, and normally whenever I show this, there may be questions that'll come up, because strategies are something that are really specific depending on your grade level. Like I said, if it's early childhood, if you're looking at a K-3 classroom, is going to be a lot different than your upper elementary, middle, and high school, obviously. But again, strategies that are, yielding this specific work around the anti-bias, designing effective anti-bias educational supports.
So while the questions are coming in, Dr. Hill, one from earlier was, how can we work with learners and families to become culturally intelligent in ways that are specific to students in our classes, especially with young learners?
You know, I think being culturally intelligent is really understanding how the family views the world and how they navigate their own environments. So it really does occur beyond just the run-of-the-mill parent-teacher conference, finding out more about, you know, what they like and dislike, some of their challenges, some of their successes. That's when you become more culturally aware, and being an effective listener. A lot of times I know when you're working with parents, again, as the expert, they're listening to you, but, you know, having that cultural intelligence is to, you know, always leave that door open for them to give you feedback or suggestions. I can share some of the cultural encounters that I've had with students, parents and families trying to, they're new to the country and trying to navigate the space and understanding California and how the schools work. And they were, you know, kind of sharing their idea of their country to where, you know, their kids were only going to school to a certain level, maybe say 6th grade. So the learning loss for being out of school, there's a bit of a challenge. But again, understanding that culture, it gave me a different perspective on how to respond to that student's needs, instead of having these assumptions that the student didn't want to do any work or lacked motivation. So leaving that door open to have the dialogue with the parents, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, where, you know, you just have a coffee or something, or you're calling them just to check in so that you're aware, and opening it up to the students by inviting their own personal experiences into the curriculum that will give you insight into the culture, because that's what they're probably going to draw on. They're going to draw from their own experiences in their own mind in terms of culture and daily interactions and things that they like. So that might be good. Yeah.
Another question we have, Dr. Hill, is what suggestion do you have for working with teachers and colleagues collaboratively who have curriculum rather that is long-standing and traditionally the same each year, that is not anti-bias, but they may not be aware of?
You know, I think it's finding ways to not to minimize their efforts, but I think we know that, you know, your theory of action for change does require a different look. Because again, we know that, you know, things are changing. It's okay to glean from the, you know, the historical foundation. It's the same thing as a researcher. I have to set it up by acknowledging the history of things that happened in the 30s before I can get you into this millennium. But at the same time, having an open mind to see where you could find ways to collaborate, and finding ways to not to minimize the efforts of the old practices, because they're still in a lot of cases valid, but I would definitely find ways to invite them into your space so that they can see it from your perspective. And I can share another story with you just in general that happens with teacher education, which is pre-service teachers versus in-service teachers who are already credentialed in classrooms. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the mentor teacher and the pre-service teacher who are colleagues. Sometimes our pre-service teachers are so gung-ho coming out of our program with the anti-bias curriculum, they're in a graduate level course, and they could get paired with a teacher who's got 25, 35 years experience, but they may not have been in a graduate level course for 16 years. So what I advise the candidates to do is you definitely glean from the history, because this, a lot of things aren't new under the sun, but at the same time, you can bring in some of the new subject-specific pedagogy and the asset-based information that you're getting in a way that they can receive it. So it's trying to find that middle ground where you're gonna it's offering compromise in a sense to where, hey, I just wanna try some of these things. Is there a way to modify your curriculum into this new standard? But having a neutral set of equity-oriented criteria, now you have a neutral party weighing it out, because now you have kind of like your data-driven decision-making that we all talk about. Now you have these equity-oriented resources that are guiding that discussion on why the change needs to happen. So that's why I love what Aubrey did from Branch Ed, is to create that criteria so that you can have those critical discussions around the curriculum. That's a fantastic question too. Is there another question, Amber?
Not that I see at the moment.
Okay.
We can continue.
All right, I will go on the next leg of the journey. 1 second here. All right, so again, we were looking at the effective strategies. Again, Linda Darling-Hammond made some great recommendations and the research that she's done around the country, looking at school systems to really look at some of the anti-bias work around the curriculum instruction and the teaching and learning. Again, education, we all know, kind of is a microcosm of society. Education is closely linked with the comprehensive development of the human being and consequently to the development of society. So again, I really, this illustration here really looks at teaching and learning. And when you can converge the two, that's where the magic happens, right? Because there's teaching on one end and there's learning, but where we're really trying to get to is here. It's the same thing with anti-bias work. When you're getting people who don't necessarily see the world through the same lens to come towards that middle, this is where magic can happen. It's the same thing with any massive changes that need to occur. We have to find ways to get people to converge their ideas and compromise and be willing to learn. So again, this is, I like it, learning about learning. And that's what we have to do when we look at anti-bias work. We're constantly improving and we're constantly learning about learning. So again, this is really interesting. And we see some of the effects of the microcosm of society that's spilling into school with motivation and not wanting to do well in school and that sort of thing, because sometimes society, the media and social media has those influences that really do distract students from really maximizing their potential. So again, I want to look at, here's the other piece. I know policy is important. Policy is sometimes at the center of what we try to do in education, and it is a driving force. We talked a lot about funding. It's always the elephant in the room. We have to follow the dollar. We see trillions of dollars being printed, but I have never seen, most of that hasn't made its way to our learning organizations, but hopefully this next round it will. But the idea are key policy levers, state funding of high quality innovative programs for high needs schools, investment in residencies and mentoring. Here at Pacific Oaks, we do that. We have a residency grant through the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, where we have residents that are being, they have 600 hours of clinical practice, and they are working with mentor teachers for 18-month structure without losing their employment. So that's a really good thing that the state is doing. In fact, it is consistent with the research. Regional infrastructure for principal learning communities. Again, we do, professional learning communities, but we need leaders to have learning communities as well. And then the technical assistance for districts who are trying to implement some of these new changes. We have to really find out the school systems that are doing it right or getting it right. And we have to find opportunities and platforms for them to share the great work that they're doing. I don't know if anyone has any comments to on this particular slide in terms of the Get It Right model, if they know some other districts or other sessions that they want to share out in the chat in terms of what they feel really works well with trying to match policies with actual programming. And that's always kind of the challenge when we're looking at finding ways to make sure the policies are supporting the educational initiatives.
Yes, Dr. Hill. So one of the questions we received is, do you think having a DIE director would be beneficial for a school? And do you think this role has to be fulfilled by an HR person with no education or teaching background, like many schools tend to do? How do you see this role really playing out in today's education?
The diversity, equity, and inclusion officer or office, I could definitely see it. I think that's a learned skill, and I don't know if it's really department specific. What you might need to do is it may still have a function of HR because, again, that's your hiring department, but I could see it being a collaborative position where you might have a diversity, equity, and inclusion office, and you have representation from every part of your organization that fill into that system. Or you designate someone's part of their full-time equivalent, their FTE, into the diversity, equity, and inclusion role with whether it be course release or a reduced unit load, depending on what your institution is like, in order to fulfill those responsibilities. But again, I know quite a few diversity, equity, and inclusion officers that work in their institutional effectiveness. And that seems to work well because then you take data around your hiring practices, your student retention data and those sort of things. And that does really fit well with the diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. I really think the other thing we have to do is look at the assessment, because sometimes the assessments aren't diverse. So that's another part where when you look at some of the data, some of the assessments aren't diverse and you're seeing the same kind of biases that have persisted for many, many years. So no, thank you for that question. That's another good question for sure.
Someone also inquired about where can they get the equity-oriented criteria from?
Yes, the equity-oriented criteria is on the OER resource webpage. And that's a free site. And then you could just put in Branch Educator Alliance, and then you will get a link right to that. But that's definitely a free, it's an open educational resource and it's free. It's kind of a work in progress. It's not anything that is a prescriptive format. You can move it around in which you see fit, but I really do think it's really valuable in terms of looking at your resources, because again, when we talk funding, schools don't always have the money to buy the new curriculum. So what you have to do is use your existing curriculum and put it up against this criteria so that you can start to seek additional resources to teach specific topics. I think there's a couple of textbooks that are floating around with the advanced placement that are showing slavery as immigration. And I know that teachers have to continuously find other resources, because I don't think slavery and immigration are in the same vein. And that's really an interesting perspective when you have that in a textbook. So you do have to find additional resources to teach specific topics to your students.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. So in the last and final 20 minutes that we have together, would you like to proceed?
Yes, I'm going to move us along a little bit, but thank you for the questions. And then I will leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A, or if there aren't any questions, I can gladly give you 10 minutes of your life back at the end. So I'm going to go on to the next slide and look at instructional leadership here. Great principals, great teacher leaders and superintendents focus on building professional learning communities, fostering educator professional development, providing instructional feedback, working with educators to improve teaching practices, using data to monitor school progress, identify problems and propose solutions, redesign school organizations. And at this part here, that's where that DEI office comes into play. Because sometimes, organizations can be a little top heavy according to parents and the community. So having that redesign, that's when you have that discussion around what offices are necessary to do the deep work around anti-bias. When you're looking at critical race, then that might be a part of the redesign. Facilitating student learning beyond the tests. That's where it's so important, where we have to really draw on their experiences and bringing their own personal experiences into the curriculum. Because that single measure is just really detrimental to some of the students in terms of just looking at a test, you don't have the grade, then you're considered low performing. And that's always been problematic. Here again, this is an iteration of Bloom's taxonomy, but we want to look at the feedback loop. What I like to do with my with the School of Ed and my teacher candidates, instead of feedback, sometimes I want feed forward. I want to give them information to move them further along in their journey. But again, closing the feedback loop for the purposes of this is really important, because what happens is you get your idea and it gets started, you get a specific practice, or you get a new approach and there's no feedback. The feedback loop is so wide that you don't really know how effective it is. So it's important to really take a deeper look at the feedback loop. Culturally inclusive pedagogy, again, this is another great quote, but again, Gloria Ladson-Billings is the leading expert around culturally inclusive pedagogy. But I like this quote from Stewart and colleagues. A culturally inclusive pedagogy removes barriers that block teachers and students from using the full range of their competencies and skills, and is linked with teachers and students' ability to fully and effectively contribute in the classroom and the world. So again, we talk about lifelong learners or preparing them for 21st century skills to enter the work profession. So the culturally inclusive pedagogy, and this kind of reminds me of one of the comments that came in around the private school. This is something here to frame that conversation with the parents, because I need you to, in order to maintain around or to be effective in the world, I need you to get on board with being culturally inclusive. So this again might lend a little bit more support in terms of those difficult conversations. Again, CASEL is really consistent with research and practice. I really do think the approach to social emotional learning, and everyone's really familiar with CASEL and their the competencies that self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. I really want to hone in on that. I think that's an important piece of inclusivity, is being a part of the decision-making process. Relationship skills for teachers and parents. Again, that's a part not only for the student social emotional learning, but it's also with teachers and the self-care, right? Teachers have to take care of themselves before they're able to take care of students. So again, those two really resonate in terms of looking at some of the anti-bias work. Here we're getting into this part here. What's a vulnerable decision point? This is where you're looking at decisions based on your implicit or explicit bias, a specific decision that is more vulnerable to effects of implicit bias. The elements are the situation and your decision state. And here's the school-wide information system that can help you with looking at just the additional resource around vulnerable decision point. So here's a unidimensional view of bias. A racial bias does lead into disproportionate discipline, i.e. when you look at some of the referrals that are occurring within schools, again, sometimes there's a hint of racial bias. So we really have to look at our disciplinary practice when it's a unidimensional view of bias. So, and then from that, we talk about stereotype threat. Again, the apprehensive over possibly self-fulfilling negative stereotypes about one's group or being judged. So Steele in 1997 gave a really good definition around that stereotype threat. And earlier you guys heard from my colleague, Dr. Grant, Dr. Grant and I have an article that's coming out pretty soon, in about maybe 3 weeks, I think next month, in a journal. And we talk about some of the psychological defenses. The disidentification relieves the pain of stereotype threat by breaking identification with the part of life where pain occurs, which necessarily includes a loss of motivation to succeed. So in our research, we kind of found that stereotype threat, you're trying to disidentify with some of those specific challenges or motivation to succeed. So I'm going to stop it there just for a second. And as we're getting close to the end, I just want to take maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then I want to get into the IDI, and that'll be, and I'll conclude with that so you guys can see a good sample of what the intercultural development inventory looks like. Amber, is there one question, or if not, I can keep moving on if nothing came in.
Yeah, someone asked for clarity around when you were referencing what racial bias leads to.
Oh, the racial bias in terms of, is it the unidimensional racial bias leading into disproportionate discipline? So when there's a racial bias in a unidimensional form, you're going to see it really play out in a discipline practice. So that student is going to be viewed in a different light than the other students based on their interaction. So when you see a racial bias, the students of color are more likely to get discipline referrals than white students. And some of the infractions that are minor for white students are considered major for Black students. So, and then I have some data around that too in the next few slides, and hopefully that'll provide some additional clarification. So I want to power through it. I'm going to move us along here. Here's a multi-dimensional view of bias, where again, the situation and a situation could be various things around the environment, how you're viewing that interaction, where you at your vulnerability point. And then again, one of the outcomes will be a disproportionate disciplinary action. And here's some of the data from Gervin and colleagues around office discipline referrals. So if you can see in blue, the minor infractions were here in the time of day. I really like this slide because what they're showing you is how it's perceived. That's where the bias is coming in. They could be doing the exact same thing, but the consequence is different. So that's really where you're starting to see, well, there has to be a bias when you can have, thousands of cases that have the same result. And that's really where you want to see, even there's really no level of being even in terms of where it occurred, minor referral, major referral, outside the classroom, inside the classroom, or end of day. It seems like end of day for Black students, it seems like there was a trend with this particular study where at the end of the day, it seems like the referral started going up. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to make assumptions. Maybe that's teacher burnout, or that was just build up throughout the day. Who knows in terms of why you're seeing that. You can make assumptions or draw conclusions based on, the disproportionality by the end of the day here when you see that gap in referrals. So again, you're seeing what's happening around that vulnerable decision point. It's a subjective office discipline referral. So it's really subjective, and that's where your implicit bias or your cultural intelligence comes in. Like, okay, I gotta know, I have to approach this a little bit differently. So again, the data is just showing how the subjectivity around referrals there's a disparity around Black children versus white students. And again, this is just another part of what our research found around motivating students, identifying motivation, again, finding what works. And again, it's really consistent with prior research that Dr. Grant and myself have really come up with the research that we've done around student motivation. Then I'm going to I want to go into some of the stats. So the National Center for Educational Statistics show that, and this is 2019, children of all races and gender perform at similar rates until the 3rd or 4th grade. And then when we started to see the 4th grade rates, we're starting to see kind of what's happening with proficiency level for white students. And then I'm going to show you, again, the proficiency level for Latino, Hispanic students, again, a lot lower than the white students. And then I'm going to go on to the teacher distribution here. where again, it's still pretty consistent, where 80% of the teachers are white and 8% are Black, 6 to 9% are Hispanic, 1 to 2% are Asian, are Pacific Islanders, American Indians, and 2 or more races are about 1%. So again, we're looking at, when we're focusing on anti-bias work, we are going to work with majority of white teachers, and the buy-in really has to be there because they're the ones that are predominantly in the profession. But all of us will all have to work together. But again, predominantly, you see about 80% of the profession is remaining at white middle class. So again, this is the data for Black students. Again, significantly lower here from 1992, you can see all the way through 2019. So you're starting to see some of the scores start to tail off. So when you see data like this, you do have to think about biases. So again, this is really the slide from 1990 through 2017, and the gap is still persistent. You start to see the achievement is still persistent throughout, a 27-year span. So then you start to have to question bias. Like, is it something, how it's being tested, how it's being scored? There's something there that we have to really wrap our minds around in terms of anti-bias work, because this, it's something about the test isn't sitting well, and the students are changing, but the outcomes are kind of being the same. So this does have you question the bias of testing and instructional practices and how schools are delivering information. Then you start looking at the discipline rates, and all those things kind of converge here when you see these gaps for such a long time. So I want to move over to here. Again, this is Dr. Tyrone Howard's book, When You Talk About Why Race and Culture Matter in Schools. Another good read for you that I highly recommend. As students begin to consistently see non-deficit-based images of themselves and their peers alongside the empowerment of all students, they become more equipped to address the various injustices and privileges. And again, this is another great book, and it talks about that achievement gap as well when you talk about how it persists, and then anti-bias work around trying to close the achievement gap is one of the big takeaways. So the next portion, as I have about 5 minutes left, I want to run you through just a little brief introductory rundown of the Intercultural Development Inventory designed by Dr. Mitchell Hammer. And we talk about how we look at our own intercultural competence with this particular tool. Inclusion, that we're looking at leveraging our differences to increase contribution and opportunities for all. How we achieve that over here, we're looking at diversity and representation and inclusion goals. Intercultural competence is the how. So again, when you look at how, we're finding ways to represent diversity through inclusive goals. So I'm going to go over, and again, this is important. Future Works cross-cultural competency is ranked 4 on the highly desirable skills for employment. So again, as we talk about students getting ready to enter the workforce, your cross-cultural competency is sliding up the list for being employable. So that's important as we look at that. I'm going to move over to the orientations. This is kind of the validity of the test, looking at the non-biased work, which is transparent and has been, tested for quite a while. I want to get to a part that really does break it down pretty well right here. So when I look at the continuum of the intercultural development, the monocultural mindset is in denial. These are the phases here. When you see the band, misses differences when you're in complete denial that it doesn't exist. Polarization, you judge differences. Minimization is where a lot of people land, where they de-emphasize difference when they say, everyone's treated equal, and we kind of miss some of the differences. The idea is to be here, acceptance and adaptation, deeply comprehends differences and bridges across differences. So what happens when you take this inventory, what'll happen is you'll have a perceived orientation and you'll have a developmental orientation. And the goal is everyone perceives that they're at adaptation or acceptance, but developmentally you might be at polarization or minimization. So as you're working through anti-bias work, your goal is to move from one band to the next. And throughout time, your goal would be to get to adaptation. So I want to stop there for a second to take questions with the last 5 minutes. But again, I want to leave this up so that you can take a deeper look at the primary orientations around developing the intercultural mindset. And this is a developmental tool, it's not evaluative, and it really does give you insight to how you respond to cultural differences. So Amber, are there any questions for me?
Yes, in our final 4 minutes together,
Okay.
what do you see as the role of teachers and leaders in this moment of so much division and conflict in the US?
I think teachers and leaders hold the keys. I mean, we have to take collaboration over competition, because at the end of the day, to bridge the gap between the injustices that are occurring, the kids at some point, as we get past the COVID and things get back to what's normal, teachers and leaders will be, they'll be kind of on the front lines. They are essential, and they hold the keys to moving society forward. I mean, I know when I look at the National Institute in Singapore, the Prime Minister says, their country is only as good as their teachers. And I think when you have that mindset, the schools are the lifeblood of those communities, and we have to get back to that. But I really do think their roles are going to be, they're already counselors and therapists and teachers do so much, and we're going to ask them to even do more in this climate. But I think there's a change where we can actually really get to see the shift in society where the kids are really excited about where the possibilities are. If we can get them past, I always use the analogy about NASA. It's like the grid to get to space. If we put that same passion, funding, and resources in schools, I bet you our kids would shoot off like a rocket too. So I'm hopeful that the teachers are up for the challenge and the leaders are ready to go, because we need them more now than ever.
That was so insightful. We are getting so much feedback from a lot of the participants in the chat who are just so grateful and thankful for you putting these resources together for them. One question we did get earlier was just around DEI coordinators and administrators, and if you had any recommendations around salary and if these positions should be full-time or part-time.
I think the DEI positions, I think everything is up to local conditions. I don't really want to weigh in on the budgetary item. In a perfect world, absolutely, it should be full-time work, because then that shows your commitment to that position. And it's a growth position. So it's something that you're going to develop through time based on your local conditions and what your actual organizational culture will yield. My recommendations are, I definitely would look at setting up some criteria around, the IDI. I would also recommend stakeholder feedback, holding your meetings to see what your stakeholders want around that position, to kind of get their thoughts around what that looks like for your particular learning organization. And lastly, as someone that really is willing to hold these forums and meet with parents and have a training and professional development lens that can work with managers, custodians, and whoever else is in your system. It's the same thing when you hear people that are with trauma-informed care, where there's certain schools in the LA County that the entire school is trauma-informed, where the office worker, the crossing guard. So I think DEI and anti-bias work has to take that same approach.
Thank you. So in the final, maybe less than 45 seconds that we have left, we want to thank everyone so much for joining us. There's so many comments still coming in with a lot of the presenters, or rather guests, who are just so grateful and thankful for your time today. And there will be a follow-up email which will provide the information to re-review this webinar, since it is being recorded. Dr. Hill, did you have any final closing words?
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time, and I know we're all busy in our new normal, and I thank you guys for your patience with some of the challenges, but I hope this is something that you can actually take back and continue to dig deeper around this work here at Pacific Oaks, feel free to reach out to us. We definitely want to lend our support in any area that we can in terms of the anti-bias work, or if there's things that you may want to ask further questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to enter those discussions and provide that support. So I really appreciate everyone's time and thank you. And I hope this was helpful, and I hope you did glean something to take back and to continue to dig deeper with this important work. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your week.